Assalamualaikum, selamat pagi. Anda menyaksikan Niaga Awani bersama saya Haris Ashraf Hasnan. Kita membuka Minggu Baharu ini dengan pelbagai perkembangan termasuklah berkait dengan analisis di mana kita mulakan dengan laporan berkait dengan ringgit di mana sentimen pasaran yang berhati-hati dijangka akan mempengaruhi pergerakan ringgit berbanding dolar Amerika pada minggu ini dengan faktor luaran kekal sebagai punca utama. Ketua Ahli Ekonomi dan Kewangan Sosial Bank Muamalat Malaysia Berhad Muhammad Afzani Zam Abdul Rashid berkata, pelabur akan memantau hasil mesyuarat Jawatankuasa Pasaran Terbuka Persekutuan FOMC Amerika Syarikat yang dijadualkan pada 13 dan 14 Jun ini yang akan memberi isyarat hala tuju selanjutnya dolar Amerika.
Pasaran dalam minggu lalu telah menyaksikan tindakan luar jangkaan Reserve Bank of Australia dan Bank of Canada yang menaikkan kadar dasar mereka sebanyak 25 mata asas. Katanya sudah wujud persepsi bahawa kemungkinan The Fed akan mengikuti langkah tersebut kerana ada dalam kalangan ahlinya masih bersandar kepada pendirian yang agak agresif. Sehubungan itu, ringgit berbanding dolar Amerika dijangka kekal dalam jajaran kecil antara 4.60 hingga 4.61 minggu ini kerana peserta pasaran mengamalkan sikap tunggu dan lihat di samping mendapatkan panduan daripada The Fed berhubung hala tuju kadar faedah. Konsensus pasaran menjangkakan Bank Pusat Amerika akan mengekalkan pendiriannya dengan meningkatkan kadar dana Fed sebanyak 25 mata asas. Sekiranya ia menjadi realiti, ini bermakna The Fed telah menambah kadar dasar sebanyak 525 mata asas dalam tempoh 16 bulan iaitu kurang daripada kitaran semasa kenaikan kadar faedah sebelumnya iaitu dari Jun 2004 hingga Jun 2006 yang mana hanya sejumlah 425 mata asas dinaikkan. Bagi minggu yang baru berakhir, ringgit adalah lebih rendah berbanding sekumpulan mata wang utama dalam tempoh 4 hari dagangan. Dari Jumaat ke Jumaat, ringgit adalah lemah berbanding dolar Amerika kepada 4.6115 daripada 4.5745 yang disaksikan semasa minggu sebelumnya. Ringgit turut diniagakan rendah berbanding mata wang lain di ASEAN.
Bursa Malaysia dijangka menyaksikan dagangan berhati-hati pada minggu ini menjelang keputusan mengenai kadar faedah di Amerika Syarikat pada Rabu. Pengarah urusan SPI Asset Management Stephen Ines berkata, pelabur tempatan akan turut memantau langkah-langkah rangsangan China untuk membantu memulihkan keyakinan pelabur. Berdasarkan prestasi bursa tempatan pada Jumaat lalu, Ines berkata indeks FBM KLCI dijangka menguji paras 1,385 pada minggu ini. Naib Presiden Penyelidikan Ekuiti Rakuten Trade Sdn Bhd Tong Pak Leng turut menjangkakan dagangan berhati-hati pada minggu ini walaupun mungkin terdapat aktiviti belian saham pada harga rendah. Pada asas Jumaat kepada Jumaat, FBM KLCI merosot 5.18 mata untuk mengakhiri minggu lalu kepada 1,376.08 daripada 1,381.26 pada minggu sebelumnya. Bagi minggu dagangan yang pendek yang baru berakhir, jumlah dagangan mingguan merosot kepada 12.70 bilion unit bernilai 6.75 bilion ringgit. Okey, pada minggu lalu sebenarnya Ipsos ada mengeluarkan data yang cukup penting, ianya berkait dengan inflasi. Ini data yang saya nak kongsikan sedikit sebelum kita menganalisis dengan lebih lanjut dan memahami dengan lebih lanjut berkenaan dengan data ini. Di mana ia melibatkan tinjauan inflasi bagi Mei 2023 yang dikeluarkan oleh Ipsos dengan kajian melibatkan lebih 21,000 responden dari 29 buah negara dan ini adalah perkara-perkara yang penting untuk kita telitikan. Pertamanya adalah berkait dengan kebimbangan berkenaan dengan inflasi. Baik, Mac saya bawakan dulu daripada Mac, April dan juga Mei. Nampaknya dari segi peratusan kebimbangan itu terus menunjukkan peningkatan 36, 39 dan juga 40. Tapi ianya 40% ini lebih rendah daripada setahun sebelumnya iaitu pada Mei 2022. Dan 4 daripada 10 rakyat Malaysia anggap inflasi merupakan salah satu isu utama negara. Jika setahun yang lalu, Mei 2022, angkanya boleh dikatakan mencecah jika tidak silap saya lebih kurang dalam 60%, tetapi ianya mula menunjukkan penurunan. Ada angka terperinci selepas ini akan saya tunjukkan kepada anda. Okey, ini melibatkan data boleh guna ataupun pendapatan boleh guna. Kalau kita bandingkan pada Jun 2022, lebih 35% ataupun hampir 40% responden menyatakan ataupun merasakan kebimbangan mereka, menyatakan kebimbangan mereka berkait dengan pendapatan boleh guna. Tetapi bagi Mei 2023, ianya mula menurun sekitar dalam 25% sahaja. Okey, tadi kita bercakap soal inflasi. Lebih 75% pada setahun yang lalu. Dan Mei ianya mula menunjukkan penurunan, dan dari segi pengangguran juga orang ramai ataupun responden menyatakan bahawa kurang bercakap ataupun mempersoalkan isu melibatkan pengangguran jika kita bandingkan pada setahun yang lalu pada Jun 2022 jika dibandingkan pada Mei 2023. Okey, ini jika kita nak bandingkan di peringkat Asia Pasifik, beberapa negara telah pun dipilih dalam kajian dapatan ini. Okey, secara purata, 1 daripada 5 rakyat Malaysia menghadapi masalah melibatkan keuangan, terutama golongan berpendapatan rendah. Dengan purata global, sekitar 37% menyatakan mereka selesa. Tetapi Malaysia hanya 24% menyatakan mereka hidup dengan selesa. Dengan angka yang besar, lebih 54% di Malaysia menyatakan mereka cukup-cukup makan sahaja. Dengan 20% menghadapi kesulitan. Okey. Ini adalah angka yang boleh dikatakan satu perkara yang perlu dibimbangkan. 54% jelas menyatakan bahawa isu kos hari hidup, perbelanjaan harian ini masih lagi mendominasi perbincangan apa yang dibualkan oleh rakyat Malaysia ataupun secara spesifiknya dalam kalangan responden. Kos beli belah makanan, kos perjalanan, pinjaman sewa rumah menunjukkan penurunan, tetapi kos beli belah makanan sedikit meningkat, menghampiri sekitar dalam turun pada November 2022 tetapi meningkat pada Mei 2023 menghampiri 70%. Okey, ini antara dapatan-dapatan yang dikeluarkan oleh Ipsos dan sudah tentu penting untuk kita telitikan bagaimana ianya memberi impak kepada kita dan bagaimana ianya memberi impak secara keseluruhan dalam perbelanjaan terutamanya. Datuk Dr. Madeline Berma bersama dengan saya. Apa khabar, Datuk?
Khabar baik, Ashraf. Terima kasih jemput saya.
Datuk, satu perkara ataupun data ini sebenarnya memberi gambaran secara keseluruhan, secara umum sahaja. Realitinya, struggle is real kalau kita melihat data itu tadi. Perbelanjaan masih lagi menjadi kebimbangan utama. Walaupun bercakap soal inflasi secara keseluruhan menunjukkan penurunan, tetapi concern ataupun kerisauan mereka, responden terutamanya adalah melibatkan perbelanjaan harian. Dan apabila kita cakap soal belanja, sudah tentu ia berkait rapat dengan inflasi juga. Datuk mengulas melihat kepada data ini.
Terima kasih ya Ashraf. Saya tadi bila melihat data tu ada dua pandangan yang ataupun perasaan saya lah ya. Yang pertama tadi saya melihat kita melihat kalau kita boleh menggunakan data sebagai apa kata indikator ya. Apa yang ditunjukkan oleh data ini pertama sekali kalau sebab tadi Ashraf membandingkan tahun yang lepas dengan tahun ini. Jadi apa yang kita lihat di sini wujudnya penambahbaikan ya Ashraf, walaupun kita kata keadaannya mungkin kurang baik, tetapi kalau kita lihat berlakunya di kalangan rakyat Malaysia ni dari segi, sebab ramai tadi yang diinterview 20 lebih ribu tapi itu di seluruh dunia. Okey, apa yang ditunjukkan di sini satu ialah berlakunya peningkatan daripada tahun lepas berbanding tahun ini, there is a slight improvement ya. Tetapi yang saya amat khawatir tadi yang ada data yang Ashraf tunjukkan keadaan hidup tadi ada sangat kecil peratusan yang mengatakan mereka selesa. Tetapi yang tengah-tengah tadi warna grey kalau tak silap saya dalam carta tu yang menunjukkan bahawa hidup sekadar macam sederhana saja. Jadi maknanya perasaan dan juga yang warna merah tadi ialah agak pesimis tentang kehidupan. Jadi Ashraf, ini keadaan yang sebenarnya kalau kita melihat di keadaan yang ini dia data yang saya nak tunjukkan. Cuma 20%, 24% saja yang mengatakan kita ni selesa. Ini sangat rendah ya kalau kita nak bandingkan dengan negara-negara lain di ASEAN. Jadi ini saya rasa kita perlu meningkatkan apakah faktor yang boleh menyumbang kepada peningkatan perasaan rasa selesa ini. Pastinya berkait rapat dengan kos sara hidup ya. Ramai yang mengatakan bahawa kos sara hidup masih tak banyak berubah sebab harga barang masih lagi tinggi. Itu yang pertama. Yang kedua, ramai yang juga bising tentang OPR yang naik sebab dia kata inflasi dah turun. Kalaulah mengikut data yang ditunjukkan oleh DOSM mengatakan kadar inflasi kita sekarang sekitar 3.4% ke 30 lebih peratus begitu ya. Jadi kalau dilihat dari segi angka tu, alasan OPR ditingkatkan ialah untuk mengawal inflasi. Jadi ini antara isu-isu yang sering menjadi tanda tanya oleh rakyat biasa ya. Dia kata kalaulah kerajaan kata kadar inflasi dah turun, tapi kenapa OPR dinaikkan? Itu yang perlu dijawab tu. Dan yang kedua yang amat mengkhawatiri ialah rakyat sekarang sedang dibuai oleh perasaan bahawa banyak subsidi yang akan dihapuskan dan diperkenalkan katanya subsidi bersasar. Tetapi siapakah yang akan disasarkan? Yang mereka khawatir ialah dia kata okeylah memang niat itu baik, iaitu untuk melaksanakan subsidi bersasar. Tetapi pengalaman lepas menunjukkan bahawa sasaran ini yang kurang tepat. Kadang-kadang orang yang tak layak menerima, orang yang patutnya menerima tidak menerima. Ini yang menjadi kekhawatiran rakyat Malaysia secara umum ya, Ashraf, yang boleh saya kongsikan.
Ya, Datuk, sudah tentu kalau kita nak memahami dan juga meneliti kepada angka yang dikeluarkan oleh DOSM sebagai contoh seperti yang Datuk sebutkan tadi, kadar inflasi 3.3% pada tahun 2022 lebih berendah daripada negara jiran. Kalau kita lihat di peringkat ASEAN, mungkin 45% rakyat Malaysia juga menjangkakan inflasi akan kembali normal dalam tempoh 1 tahun. Itu unjuran yang dikeluarkan oleh Ipsos sendiri menerusi tinjauan pendapat tersebut. Moving forward, menuju ke hadapan, dasar amat penting dan juga bagaimana polisi-polisi yang perlu dilaksanakan dalam memastikan bahawa rakyat tidak rasa terbeban disebabkan oleh peningkatan-peningkatan kos tertentu, terutamanya dari segi makanan, sama ada barang basah ataupun makanan di luar rumah, pada masa sama menanggung subsidi seperti yang dimaklumkan oleh kerajaan. Mungkin ada yang menyatakan kerisauan seperti Datuk katakan, adakah rumah saya ni naik ke tak naik bil elektriknya nanti. Persoalan-persoalan sebegini melibatkan dasar. Bagaimana pentingnya untuk saya suka nak bawa perbincangan kita melihat kepada bagaimana kerajaan pentingnya untuk berkomunikasi dan memberi mesej yang jelas kepada rakyat berkait dengan dasar-dasar, terutamanya perkara-perkara yang melibatkan ekonomi rakyat, poket rakyat ini, Datuk.
Terima kasih Ashraf. Ini perkara yang kita dah bincang berkali-kali ya, dan saya amat menghargai apa yang dilakukan oleh Astro yang cuba membawa perbincangan ini ke peringkat angkar umbi ya. Sebab bukan mudah ya untuk kita menyampaikan maklumat berkaitan dengan polisi ataupun dasar kerajaan ya. Sebab dasar ini memang dia adalah satu yang agak bersifat agak sukar untuk difahami. Contoh bila kita sebut dasar fiskal, kita sebut dasar monetary, satu itu dilaksanakan oleh Bank Negara, satu ialah kerajaan. Jadi bagaimana untuk menyampaikan maklumat ini ke peringkat rakyat jelata supaya mereka faham bahawa sebenarnya benda ni ada usaha yang telah dilakukan dan sedang dilakukan oleh kerajaan untuk menanganinya. Sebab ramai yang berkata sebenarnya kerajaan tak ada buat apa pun. Sebab apa yang mereka dengar adalah ucapan-ucapan yang dikeluarkan oleh mungkin yang berhormat menteri ataupun yang diucapkan oleh parti-parti politik ataupun politician. Jadi kadang-kadang naratif itu yang menguasai perbincangan yang sebenarnya, seperti apa yang Ashraf sebutkan tadi. Dasar yang sebenarnya. Saya percaya, saya amat mengharapkan ya media memainkan peranan yang penting, mengambil perbincangan supaya ia lebih mudah difahami oleh rakyat jelata ya. Bila kita nak menterjemahkan, sebab kalau ekonomi mereka menggunakan core inflation, mereka menggunakan headline inflation, istilah-istilah yang kadang-kala saya sendiri pun sukar nak menjelaskan kepada rakyat jelata. Apa itu dia headline inflation, core inflation, ataupun istilah-istilah yang disebut tadi, yang kita kata OPR. Tapi bagusnya sekarang rakyat semua dah sedar OPR tu. Tapi dia tahu sekarang, bila OPR naik, dia melompat. Dia kata kenapa OPR dulu dia okeylah, dia kata Bank Negara baru mengumumkan OPR naik. Bagi dia tak ada benda zaman dulu. Tetapi sekarang sebab kita dah semakin didedahkan dengan maklumat dan juga fakta, maka saya rasa penjelasan yang terperinci, penjelasan yang jelas dan lebih penting lagi ialah apakah implikasinya kepada rakyat ini perlu dijelaskan dengan baik, ya, Ashraf. So saya mengharapkan Astro akan terus melakukan apa yang you all sering lakukan, iaitu bagaimana berkomunikasi dengan rakyat supaya lebih mudah difahami. Itu ada gambar ayam tu. Bukan senang nak jelaskan kenapa harga ayam turun ataupun kenapa harga ayam terus kekal tinggi. Begitulah dia.
Datuk, sudah tentu bercakap soal harga barang, kita tidak boleh lari apabila ringgit yang pada ketika ini berada pada paras yang boleh dikatakan rendah pada ketika ini, dan unjuran menyatakan bahawa mungkin harga-harga barang terutama imported goods akan terus melambung tinggi. Mungkin jangkaan Datuk sendiri melihat kepada mungkin intervensi yang mungkin boleh dilakukan oleh kerajaan apabila mata wang ringgit ini rendah, imported goods akan meningkat kerana peratusan imported goods kita tinggi juga. Mungkin penjelasan Datuk, mungkin intervensi di peringkat kerajaan dalam memastikan harga barangan terus terkawal.
Okey, ini sesuatu perkara yang sangat merisaukan ramai orang juga bila melihat nilai mata wang kita semakin menyusut, ya. Dan dulu saya ingat lagi, ya, ramai yang begitu teruja apabila kita melihat apabila kerajaan baru kita naik, masa ketika itu harga ataupun pertukaran mata wang kita begitu kukuh sekali. Tapi sekarang kita kena faham, bahawa benda ini adalah di luar kawalan, Yang ini adalah isu antarabangsa. Itu rakyat kena faham. Jangan kita kata, oh inilah kerajaan. Semua sering nak menuding jari dengan kerajaan saja. So mata wang ini, yang pertama sekali kita kena ingat, apabila kita membeli barang dan barang khususnya barangan import, maka banyak barang nilai mata wang yang urus niaga ini dilakukan dengan menggunakan mata wang asing, iaitu kebanyakannya menggunakan mata wang Amerika Syarikat. So itu yang kita ada mendengar ura-ura bagaimana ada di setengah-setengah pihak yang mengatakan mungkin sudah tiba waktunya kita jangan terlalu bergantung kepada mata wang Amerika Syarikat. Kita perlu menggunakan mata wang lain. Di kalangan negara ASEAN, kita berdagang dengan mata wang kita sendiri. Ada juga yang berpandangan sedemikian. Itu nombor satu, itu jangka masa panjang. Ya. Jangka masa pendek ialah bagaimana negara perlu, kita boleh mengurangkan barangan import kita. Dan ini juga memerlukan masa. Tetapi macam contoh tadi yang disebutkan, kita banyak lagi membeli barangan import. So memang tiba waktunya, tapi ini benda ini kita sudah bincang berkali-kali. Bagaimana kita perlu mengurangkan barangan import. Ini macam contoh cili. Kita masih lagi mengimport daripada China. Kita masih lagi mengimport daripada India. So bagaimana, adakah kita berkeupayaan untuk menghasilkan barangan itu sendiri di dalam negara kita? So kita perlu beralih sekarang daripada mengimport barangan dan kita kurangkan konten import kita untuk dengan meningkatkan benda yang boleh kita beli dari dalam negara kita. Kita sudah tidak ada keupayaan untuk sentiasa bergantung kepada barangan import. It is high time untuk kita menghasilkan, mengeluarkan barangan yang boleh kita, satu, kita keluarkan dalam negara kita, yang mana kita boleh keluarkan. Nombor dua, rakyat-rakyat kita yang kaya raya tu, yang kluster kayangan tu, kita harapkan juga mereka mengurangkan barangan, membeli barangan dari luar negara. Sebab kalau kita lihat, ya, ramai juga di kalangan mereka yang dalam golongan T20 yang atas sekali itu, mereka masih lagi berbelanja untuk membeli barangan di luar negara, berbelanja di luar negara. Begitu macam contoh kita bercuti. Mungkin sudah tiba waktunya rakyat kita tingkatkan lagi jumlah untuk bercuti di dalam negara daripada pergi ke luar negara. Itu mengibatkan pengaliran keluar mata wang kita. So itu antara yang benda yang jangka pendek lah, Ashraf, yang boleh saya bincangkan. Ya.
Ya, sudah tentu Datuk, banyak perkara yang boleh kita perincikan dan intervensi daripada kerajaan dan inisiatif daripada kerajaan amat penting untuk memastikan bahawa terutamanya harga barangan yang setiap hari dibeli oleh rakyat ini sentiasa terkawal dan kebergantungan terhadap import juga dapat dikurangkan. Terima kasih sekali lagi Datuk Dr. Madinin Burma, Fellow Kehormat Institut Masa Depan Malaysia, berkongsi pandangan dan juga cetusan idea melibatkan isu inflasi dan juga kos sara hidup. Permudahkan hal birokrasi dan perundangan itu dua perkara yang perlu diberi perhatian sekiranya hasrat pelaburan projek mampan mahu dijayakan. Pelaburan projek mampan belum sampai ke tahap yang dilihat seksi dalam konteks pulangan. Namun ia penting untuk dilaksanakan demi kelestarian jangka panjang. Justru Pengarah Eksekutif FMDV Global Fund for Cities, Carlos de Freitas, melihat setiap negara ada cabaran berbeza. Namun, cabaran yang sama adalah soal bagaimana pengurusan pendanaan dilaksanakan dan dipermudahkan.
Basically, you have the decentralization process, which helps in supporting the revenues, the transfers from the central government to the local governments, the revenue stream of the local government as a basic basis for implementing the service provision, and you have the own source revenues, meaning through the local taxes, to help raising funds for the local budget to make sure that they can then go for debt or to get private sector contracting in implementing the service provision. So it depends on the contexts. But usually, in most of the cases, in the global south, the cities and the regions, they don't have the processes, the rules and regulations allowing them to have the qualified human resources in-house to make sure that there is a follow-up, that the financial division follows the requirements of the banking system, commercial or even public development finance coming from development partners. So you need to be inventive, to be creative.
Sementara itu, Carlos berkata pelaburan projek mampan berdepan cabaran mengikut wilayah. Di bahagian utara global, mereka sudah memulakan perbandaran sejak beratus tahun dan untuk bertukar ke projek mampan memerlukan pendanaan tinggi. Malah mereka juga tidak ada bahan mentah yang cukup kerana bahan mentah tertumpu di bahagian selatan global. Di selatan global pula cabarannya berbeza kerana mereka ada bahan mentah, tetap soal pendanaan menjadi cabaran utama. Selatan global merujuk kepada Amerika Latin, Afrika, Asia dan Oceania, manakala utara global merujuk kepada negara seperti Amerika Syarikat, United Kingdom, Kanada, Eropah, Rusia, Jepun dan lain-lain.
And we are facing a global crisis, poly crisis, as the UNSG has commented. So that means that they don't even have the resources. They are not that much powerful countries as they used to be when you had the colonization process. So the wealth somehow is in the global south, land, minerals, whatever you have, it's there. And the global north now is struggling in terms of budget. They are very indebted countries, and so their margin for implementing, renewing the adapted urban context to the climate changes requires so much funding now, finance.
Menggaya dan menyikat menyebabkan rambut gugur. Lupakan rambut gugur. Dove Hair Boost Nourishment Baharu. Shampoo bertekstur ringan dengan micellar membersih akar rambut dan kalsium kompleks menguatkan rambut untuk 10 kali kurang rambut gugur. Dove Baharu.
Listen to me, Billy. The fate of your world depends on it. The daughters of Atlas are coming for you.
Children stole the power of all the gods. This is very personal, Billy.
Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad akan mengadakan pertemuan rasmi dengan Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin.
Itu kita akan bincang.
Hukuman berat harus dikenakan.
Satu hukuman berat untuk diadakan.
Krisis air di Sabah dilihat menunjukkan perkembangan positif.
Dalam masa tempoh 6 bulan, masyarakat akan dapat merasa perubahan bekalan air tersebut.
8 kawasan di serata negara mengalami cuaca panas pada tahap berjaga-jaga. Sebanyak 14 kes strok haba dilaporkan.
Sering menggaya dan menyikat menyebabkan rambut gugur? Lupakan rambut gugur. Dove Hair Boost Nourishment Baharu. Shampoo bertekstur ringan dengan micellar membersih akar rambut dan kalsium kompleks menguatkan rambut untuk 10 kali kurang rambut gugur. Dove Baharu.
Bertemu kembali dalam Niaga Awani. Kita teruskan dengan laporan pasaran niaga minyak sawit mentah MSM tempatan dijangka diniagakan dalam jajaran kecil dengan kecenderungan penurunan pada minggu ini menjelang data mengenai industri minyak sawit bagi Mei 2023 dikeluarkan. Peniaga minyak sawit David Ng berkata data itu yang dikeluarkan oleh Lembaga Minyak Sawit Malaysia MPOB akan memberikan kejelasan yang lebih baik mengenai kedudukan stok minyak sawit negara kepada peniaga dan pelabur serta membantu menentukan langkah mereka yang seterusnya dalam pasaran. Sebelum ini, Persatuan Minyak Sawit Malaysia berkata pengeluaran minyak sawit negara dianggarkan meningkat 26.33% kepada 1.51 juta tan pada Mei berbanding April. Minggu lalu, niaga hadapan MSM diniagakan bercampur-campur menjejaki niaga hadapan minyak kacang soya di Lembaga Perdagangan Chicago dan berikutan kebimbangan mengenai pengeluaran yang meningkat pada masa depan. Pada asas mingguan, kontrak Jun 2023 meningkat RM62 kepada RM3,478 satu tan. Julai 2023 menambah RM2 kepada RM3,408 satu tan dan Ogos 2023 merosot RM14 kepada RM3,367 satu tan. Harga MSM fizikal bagi Jun Selatan kekal tidak berubah pada RM3,450 satu tan. Aquascape mungkin fenomena baru bagi penggemar ikan hiasan di negara ini. Dekorasi ilham dari Jepun ini ternyata menjadikan akuarium dan ikan lebih menarik. Menimba ilmu melalui YouTube, ia berjaya menjadikan belia dari Johor Baharu ini meluaskan perniagaannya.
Aquascape ialah akuarium yang dalamnya dihias dengan pelbagai tumbuhan air sehingga menampakkan seolah-olah berada di dalam hutan air atau bawah laut. Usahawan Toki Aquarium Abdul Halim Muhammad yang telah 4 tahun mengusahakan perniagaan aquascape akui dia mempelajari pelbagai teknik melalui platform YouTube. Selain menyediakan dekorasi dalam akuarium yang berunsurkan tropikal dan semula jadi, perkakasan aquascape seperti dekorasi kayuan, pokok dan susun atur juga direka sendiri.
Dekat sini kita konsepkan dengan tropical, bermaksud dia lebih nampak natural lah. Lebih nampak natural, lebih nampak relax. Sebab kita tak pada predator ataupun ikan-ikan yang besar ataupun yang orang nampak simple je lah. Kita buat sedikit kelainan yang berkait dengan alam semula jadi. Okey, kita ada daripada YouTube, daripada Japan. Sebab untuk makluman kita aquascape yang first adalah daripada Japan lah, daripada Takashi Akano lah. Agaknya nama dia lebih kurang macam tu lah, sebab saya kurang tu, dan banyak daripada Indonesia, daripada Filipina, daripada negara-negara Asia lah aquascape ni daripada mereka. Dan kita ada juga belajar kalau macam tumbuhan, saya belajar daripada Jabatan Perikanan sendiri yang bawa kita ada khusus daripada Jabatan Perikanan macam mana nak transfer pokok daripada pokok biasa ke pokok air, dan macam mana nak buat perpindahan dia lah.
Bercerita lanjut, katanya jenis-jenis ikan untuk aquascape berbeza dengan akuarium biasa. Ikan untuk aquascape lebih kecil dan berwarna terang serta bercorak. Gupu, anglefish dan neon tetra menjadi pilihan kerana ia tidak akan merosakkan tumbuhan dalam air. Malah, penggunaan tumbuhan air menjadikan jangka hayat ikan hiasan dalam akuarium lebih panjang.
Menteri Perdagangan Dalam Negeri dan Kos Sara Hidup KPDN Datuk Seri Saludin Ayub melakukan sesi pemantauan sempadan negara Malaysia Thailand pada Ahad. Pemantauan itu dilakukan di Pengkalan Kubur, Kelantan. Lawatan sempadan itu diadakan bersama rakan strategik penguatkuasaan pasukan Polis Marin Wilayah 3, Pengkalan Kubur bersama Agensi Penguatkuasaan Maritim Malaysia Kelantan. Salahuddin turut mengadakan sesi ramah mesra dengan pasukan Polis Marin Wilayah 3 dan pasukan Polis Marin Thailand dalam lawatan tersebut. Turut hadir Timbalan Menteri KPDN Fuziah Saleh, Ketua Setiausaha KPDN Dato' Azman Muhammad Yusof dan beberapa pegawai kanan dari kementerian dan agensi terlibat. Niaga Awani, kita berhenti rehat seketika. Selepas ini anda akan bersama dengan rakan saya Ibrahim Sani. Kita berehat dahulu, berjumpa selepas ini.
Dia boleh kahwin lebih dari satu.
Dugaan hidup bermadu.
Dia duakan akak. Kenapa?
Dia seorang suami yang adil.
I'm sorry.
Benda dah nak jadi. Aku akan balas dekat kamu.
Selamat pagi semua. Jangan duduk. Dia masak sendiri.
Awak ni dah kenapa?
Okey. Kau buat apa dengan anak saya? Tak buat apa-apa ni.
Janice sakit masuk hospital. Puas hati.
Membuka suami berlaku adil. Saksikan Hijrah Jana di Astro dan Astro Go.
Stres juga kan? Bila nak stream tengok movie atau bola kat rumah, internet tak kencang, lagging sana sini. Sebab itulah setiap rumah perlukan router Wi-Fi 6 Astro Fiber. Walaupun lebih 10 peranti bawah satu bumbung, router Wi-Fi 6 Astro Fiber ni sangat powerful. Router Wi-Fi 6 ni 3 kali lebih kencang daripada Wi-Fi 5. Tadi kita cakap pasal bola kan? Gol! Liga Malaysia sekarang dah ada dekat Astro. Ada satu bandar jimat. 50 Mbps fiber dengan Astro dan Liga Malaysia hanya RM149.99 saja sebulan. Tawaran ni terhad tau. Dapatkan sekarang sebelum direbut orang. WhatsApp nombor ni sekarang.
Thanks for joining us. My name is Ibrahim Sani. We're still talking about healthcare and the role that it has when it comes to digitization. Joining me this morning in the studio on my left is Rod Fraser, the Managing Director of Siemens Healthineers. Rod, thanks for taking time to speak with us. Let's talk a little bit more about Siemens Healthineers and the interrelation it has with Siemens per se.
Okay. Siemens Healthineers is, in fact, it's been around for over 100 years with that Siemens group. But what changed was back in 2016, the decision to list on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. And so what that triggered was also a whole heap of capital raising, and as a consequence are able to start investing more broadly along sort of, let's call it the healthcare value stream. So originally, Siemens Healthineers were focusing on imaging modalities and also laboratory, point of care as well. And but of course diagnostics is one side, therapies is the other. So they'd already gone into, let's say, image assisted minimally invasive surgery, but then thought, okay, let's get into cancer therapy as well. Now, so after that, let's say after the float, they were then able to move into the space of buying Varian, one of the largest acquisitions, one of the largest companies in cancer therapy. They were able to buy that in, let's say, 2021. And now we've got this complete value stream, which puts us in a really wonderful position in being able to, assist our doctors, clinicians across, from screening, diagnostics, through to therapy.
It's always a little bit macabre talking about NCDs, particularly when it comes to oncology, but it is what it is when it comes to the growth of this sector. Nobody's going to dispute the role of oncology service providers, such as yourself, as well as oncologists, I suppose, when it comes to trying to bring value for patients around the world. But what interests me when it comes to having this interview is the uncharacteristic corporate behavior of Siemens to try and list a subsidiary when normally, especially among your competitors and your peers, corporate peers, I mean, it's normally held within the family group. It's normally privately held. Why the need to move towards getting listed 6-7 years ago? And what is the intent? Is it because you want to spend a little bit more in R&D? Is it to bring transparency to investors in terms of the periodical requirements of reporting? So people like your clients, for instance, hospitals around the world can see, okay, this company is doing this for this month. Is that the intent?
I think it was looking at the conglomerate, right? What was happening. And I'm not the expert of the exact decision, right? But
of course,
I think looking at the actual multiples, healthcare, and looking at power generation, a whole bunch, they're completely different decisions, right? So what they believed, I think, if they could raise that cash and then say the decision as a separate company would be completely different as to just what sort of level of risk you would take as well. And really, that was the signal to say, let's look at robotics, let's start looking into digital health in a bigger way, because they've all, I think, as you know, Siemens Healthineers and the bigger group have always been looking at digital data, AI. That's always been a critical feature in that landscape for the Siemens group. But then expanding into therapy, which is not really another company is doing what we're doing at the moment from that perspective. So it gave the company a completely different profile with the investment community and recognition as well. The Siemens Healthineers was a trigger. That was the new brand back in 2017 to then get, reach out to, when you're being on the stock market, you're a completely different company than you are when you're in a family, really a family group. So it's not to say Siemens don't invest. I think 80% of the shares were Siemens, but it then means we're going out to public, superannuation schemes, etc. So it's a completely different profile. And I think that sensitivity to the stock market is also important about making sure that what you say is what you're going to deliver as well.
Absolutely. And you will be held accountable, I guess, in the eyes of the investors as well as observers and analysts. Let's talk a little bit more about the medtech or medical technology industry right now. This is quite an exciting period, I suppose. We are at the advent of adopting AI and generative AI in how we do things. Do you feel that this is where the intersection of the value that Siemens Healthineers can bring both to your institutional clients as well as to patients around the world? Let's talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, I mean, can I put a little bit of context around what's happening in Malaysia at the moment? So we're a direct player. So we're one of the only direct players in the market. And that's been an evolution over the last 40 years. If I look at what happened at the start, we were just deploying equipment because it was an opportunity as the hospitals were being built. And so it was that first wave of just getting boxes out there, if you want to call it, CT scanners, MRs, laboratory equipment, right? But if you look at that as a microcosm, if you go to the global footprint, we've got a massive now number of pieces of equipment across the world, right? So more than, I think it's 600,000 pieces of equipment that we can now leverage in terms of data.
Sorry, 600,000 what SKUs is that?
When you're looking at, it depends upon the equipment, but it's looking at, for instance, MRs, CTs, laboratory, whether it's core lab laboratory, devices at point of care setting, so at the patient community-based setting. So talking about first, this is the context that we're looking at from a Siemens Healthineers point of view, and that trigger to say, let's start thinking about what could we do with that data if we're working with the right partners. That means clinicians, it also means big institutions. We're associated with 90% of the biggest medical institutions around the world. So that was, I think, a fundamental to say, within the convergence of technology, what can you now do with, say, artificial intelligence? How can you use those data streams? Now bring that back to Malaysia.
Before you go on, direct player means that what? You directly engage with the clients outright?
In Malaysia, about 90% of we've got our technical teams, our sales teams, we've got our engineering groups.
No intermediaries, no distributors?
Very minimal.
Okay,
very minimal.
All right.
And I think it was that evolution that we started 40 years ago, and we've built up the business. It makes sense for us to be a direct player, engage directly, certainly on the technical level. But I think for the Malaysia context, we'll go back 40 years ago to what it is today. It's now about upgrading. We're at the stage in Malaysia that there's a change from going infectious disease management now through non-communicable diseases, right, is a big feature of the new Malaysian landscape. And of course, unfortunately so. So it's a challenge, and you see there's a white paper from the Ministry of Health that's going to be tabled in June, talking about rates of diabetes, for instance. 1 in 5 people
that's right,
potentially diabetics.
With undiagnosed, many of them undiagnosed.
Yeah, exactly. 1 in 2 are potentially.
1 in 2 of those 1 in 5 is undiagnosed.
Exactly right.
Potential.
Weight and other lifestyle topics as well is another critical factor.
Diet,
And the government's saying if we look at, let's say, the profile, also the ageing community, 1 in 6 people will be over the age of 65 by 2040, right? Okay, we could have a problem. So how do we engage differently, right? So yeah, well, the economics won't make so much sense, right? So I think for the government, they're starting to say, look, rather than this is a pivot time to say bricks and mortar, what can we do in the community setting?
That's right.
So where can Siemens, if you start thinking about digital, data, artificial intelligence, how can we help a setting that potentially won't have all the resources, won't have all the clinicians, and let's say the infrastructure in play? What can we do in a smart way with data?
Let's talk about that. What are you thinking about when it comes to doing things smart way using data? What kind of partners are you striking up with right now? And quite frankly, how do you see the industry moving forward when it comes to providing that ongoing care and knowledge to the patients out there in Malaysia?
Okay, I think there's a few different settings, right? There could be at the patient themselves and maybe, let's say, democratizing their own healthcare, in a sense, being able to travel with the data, right? And that data guiding or influencing the way that patient will react. So, for instance, we call this, from the Siemens point of view, is digital twinning.
Okay.
Right? So the goal, the end game, I guess, would be to have our smartphone or a tablet or a device that would be able to have the relevant information that would sit with the patient. And that information, let's say if we had a chronic illness, would be the sensors would then be picking up that data, going to the phone, and then using artificial intelligence of different types of apps to be able to guide the patient through that journey from sickness to wellness, or keeping them well from the start. This is something that's becoming a reality, and we see that in the future. That's the patient side. Now, at the clinician side, the challenge really, when we look at the transition from the bricks and mortar, the hospitals, to the community setting, is that if I'm a doctor and I've got the patient presented to me for the first time, they could have any one of many diseases, right? And so
they're not mutually exclusive. You can have a plethora.
Yeah, it could be from the doctor's point of view. They're doing their best in a community setting, but that triage point, using artificial intelligence and using the wealth of data that potentially could be at their disposal, could help them make that first interaction a positive one. So figuring out, okay, that a generalized symptom could lead to many different outcomes. So for using artificial intelligence, and as an example, if I was to do a blood test, which is what we do, or a scan of your chest, we have already large aggregates of data working through these various institutions around the world to be able to now use that, let's say more than 1 billion patients in our aggregated data sets, to then have AI-guided deep learning algorithms that can then pick up, let's say if it's a chest x-ray, we'll say, oh, look, I just found might be a lesion in the lung, but at the same time, if I'm the clinician there, and I might be a specialist in that area, he would have picked it up anyway, or she would have picked it up anyway. But also, we'll just notice something else that's happening from, say, bone. It could also be calcification, a whole bunch of other things that could be picked up through the assist of artificial intelligence. Now, we're working with the MDA already, the Medical Device Authority, to already have some of these approvals done. Now, because it's real time, these data sets are real time. We're not sending patients with the demographics of the patient to the cloud, but what we're doing is we're using the raw data to then look at the broader set of data to use artificial intelligence then to guide, this is what would have to happen, this is the direction you need to take, and this is what it's found. So the AI could just basically write the whole report for the doctor. That's potentially what can already happen. And the doctor would still be responsible to go through the report and say, yeah, this makes sense. I didn't pick that one up, or I agree with the findings. That can be done a lot quicker.
Itu bukan cara nak nyanyi, adik. Jilat Flexi Vibe, kepala fleksibel. Cukup sekali terus licin. Cukup sekali terus licin, tak kecoh. Jilat Flexi Vibe.
Big Stage 2023, loading now.
Life is a big stage, we've got a power. Hingga kini berjaya.
Dominasi generasi Baharu. Powerhouse dengan gaya tersendiri. Lebih berkuasa dengan semangat dan sokongan peminat. Big Stage, siaran langsung Ahad 9 malam di Astro Ria dan Astro Go.
My line of questioning is going to be everywhere, so let me just organize my thoughts. First is, I'm clustering my thoughts right now because this is an extremely interesting element. First cluster of conversations that I want to have moving forward now is on the level of general practitioners out there. They are not specialists, but they are GPs in its very sense of word, and they have to be the first line of diagnostics out there. And how would the tools that you provide or your peers are providing in terms of ensuring that the first line of triage, I suppose, can be better managed in a way where it can probably triage the patient accordingly to the specialists that they need. Second is, data privacy is actually the most crucial right now, and whether or not you have to strike a balance between the amount of data and how you blind that data to the AI, to the cloud, and at the same time getting the most out of those data so that you can build a map in terms of what is wrong with the patient or what could possibly go wrong with the patient. The third is, of course, the haves and the have-nots. When it comes to socioeconomic structure, I have an Apple Watch. I am going to be tracked every day, and all I need is folks like you to talk to Apple, build an SKI, and I can feed my data there, but I am not the majority. We're looking at, let's say, 9 in 10 that do not have the kind of toys, I suppose, that is on my body right now that can help them diagnose properly. So these are the three big questions that I have. Let's start with the capacity and the capability of the GP per se. How are they equipped when it comes to dealing with this kind of information? Are they going to be trained, and at whose cost? The MOH, your cost, or how?
I think it's good to look at two settings, right? So the Ministry of Health, and the challenge is where we're looking at more remote locations. So geography is a challenge in that setting. It may be a GP, there may be interaction from other supporting nurses and others. So it's not necessarily always going to be a GP at that first interaction. And the patient may or may not be sick, right?
Of course,
right at the moment, the patients are typically presenting and they're showing symptoms, right?
That's right.
And so, yeah, it's absolutely critical. AI could support. We're not necessarily, Siemens are not into the device side of the business, so we know it's a massive, already a massive area of sensors and other things to be able, or other tools at the disposal now of the patient that have already been invested. For us, we're interested in the data, the aggregation of that data, and then clinical decision support to the relevant stakeholders. So it may be a clinician in a remote location, or, as I say, that could be Ministry of Health setting where they're exploring and wanting to develop this further. But also in the private, if you're in the private setting, you may already be in a very advanced integrated environment. So from that perspective, the GPs, let's say if we're on the west coast of the peninsula, it could be a completely different setting where that first interaction may then go straight to a specialist, and that specialist will then, so the triage steps may be actually more clearly defined. And the private sector in Malaysia is really at the top of its game. And so I think we're reading just #1 in medical tourism. So people, we're already on the map when it comes to the quality of that service delivery as a complete package. It's not to say that the clinicians in the Ministry of Health, they're normally looking at the volume of the business, so they're actually very, very skilled.
Of course.
But I think it's that what you're saying is back on at the GP level, how do we assist them? One of those
things, community clinics out there in the peripheries.
One of those things will be, one, the patient itself, and there's examples in other countries, like say, looking at Switzerland, for instance. There's examples where that data is already available to every patient. So it's available. So whether the person is remote or whether they're in the city, that doesn't factor.
So where does Siemens Healthiness come in this?
So what we've been doing is looking at what we'd call an e-health strategy. So it's to say, when you look at the traditional way that information is stored and managed, it sits within disciplines of hospitals. It may sit in a GP setting in still analog form, right? Written notes, right? That's the challenge that the ministry is also looking at with the second white paper, to figure out what's the best way.
Second white paper, not the paper that you referred to earlier.
So there's a health white paper, but also they're looking at what can we do in terms of how we manage that data, and then make sure the right stakeholders have the right information. So this is, I'd call this precision. We call it, the industry or let's say the profession calls it either personalised healthcare or precision medicine. So what it means, having the right information, the right diagnostic, the right therapy at the right time for the right patient. That's fundamental. Is you're going to have a data set available to the patient and also to the GP, and that information needs to be appropriately shared with the specialist or a collaborative group, depending upon the disease, right? So this is ultimately the patient would own the data, but at the moment it's still sitting for various reasons, either in a silo. Hopefully
this
not
industry
in
needs to be disrupted.
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunity.
And there's a lot of questions I want to ask you, at least on this point, but we have to move on because of time constriction.
Yeah. So I mean, the summary for me would be Siemens. We won't change the whole underlying system, but we'll sit at the top and be able to move that data appropriately across those.
But you do sit in a place where it's privileged, where you can actually assign the kind of rules and requirements of all these other players to come into play. It's an amazing place to be at, by the way. But we have to move to the second idea that I was trying to address, the balance between data, how much is shared, how much is being retrieved, who is looking at this data, and of course, how is the data being secured? I don't imagine anybody is having any malintent in this whole supply chain, but things can go awry. AI, we don't know what is the advent or the usage of AI. I'm not talking about Terminator level, but look, it can be spread across and it might be interpreted, and there are malactors out there to a point where they can actually misuse the data. So how do you ensure that data is secured, the right amount of data is getting to the right person, and so on?
Okay, so in terms of the Malaysia context, which is typically the data sits with the hospital at the moment, it's sitting with the hospital, and from the data perspective, there is sort of this evolution. Even though it's a revolution, there's this evolution of saying, where does that data go? So for us, you normally would have a zone that would keep the information private with the patient, the demographics, and all the relevant sensitive information is always kept with the patient and that institution. For us, we take only the data, and that is then fed to cloud. And that cloud can be either on-prem.
Well, who decides what data is relevant or not?
There's two areas. There's the patient. They release the information that they agree to, but they never release their own personal data. They're only releasing the data, maybe this cholesterol.
Alarm bells are ringing, sorry.
Yeah, so just to put it into that context, the way that is orchestrated now is that without Siemens' involvement, is the institution controls the privacy, and the patient at the moment is taking that record, normally hard copy,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, the pieces of paper.
But
yeah.
the way I see it evolving for Malaysia at the moment is to have the data on premises. So it will go to cloud, but the cloud will be maintained within the premises. That will be the first step. So there is a sensitivity about sending data overseas. So at the moment, that doesn't happen. So it will be a step through. We will work with like let's say infrastructure providers that are already existing within in Malaysia and already, let's say, supported by the government, to make sure that that step is not done out of sequence, so that all of a sudden we lose control of that environment. But it's very important to understand that Siemens are already working in countries across the world to make sure there are no data leaks. It's not to say it's impossible, but it has to be done in a sequence. It has to be done in a sequence. So the accreditation for Siemens when it comes to data management is at the top. It's already at the top anyway.
Also, you don't want to lose who you are. You are, at the very sense, not a data providing company. You are, a
for
health
us,
provider.
we just want the data to be able to explore, let's say, clinical decision support for the clinician. That's our goal.
Yeah.
Yeah. The data itself is not relevant to us, and we don't want a data breach either.
Okay.
So we work with those stakeholders to make sure things are secure.
And the final idea that I want to explore is, of course, the haves and the have-nots. We're looking at socioeconomic structure in the country is not where we want it to be, and heading towards an area where we are trying to prolong people's lives, trying to reduce non-communicable diseases, trying to improve lifestyle is also an ongoing effort.
Yeah.
We're nowhere near where we want to be. So how does this benefit those that do not have access to these kind of services as opposed to the minority of us that do?
Yeah, I guess there is actually an infrastructure in Malaysia. It's just the age, potentially, the deterioration of that infrastructure. There is a place for us to help in that area. So equipment that's already deployed could be, let's say, repurposed with software, etc. Right? So it's not to say let's throw everything out at that point, but it definitely there needs to be replacement and investment, and potentially different ways of financing that, let's say, the equipment infrastructure. That's one step to make sure, even in the more remote settings, and then to think about what's the newer technology that could go into the remote segments, assisted by, let's say, ways of being able to bring, whether a clinician sitting in KL, how can they assist on the clinical decision from KL to the remote setting? That's another area that we can currently explore. Or even the equipment being operated with expertise from another area across more a broader network. These things are things that we can look into. But the haves and the have-nots, when it comes to the let's say, access to care in those remote settings, is something we're investing in as well. Because we recognise that this is a challenge across the world. When you look
should a private company, well, I guess public company, should the private setting do this instead of relying on governmental infrastructure?
I mean, let's say our purpose as a company is really to innovate healthcare for everyone, everywhere. That's the goal. So for us our R&D is going into this area as well. So we want to make sure that, just an example of how you could do it is we already are looking at the premium end of the technology band when it comes to a CT or an MR, or I mentioned Varian with the Linacs, which is for a treatment of cancer, right? A lot of the stuff we're innovating there, we're actually bringing down into what you might call the value segment. It's not to say, let's say a little bit cheaper, but then being able to bring that technology to those remote settings. But it's not just a matter of a box. It's actually making sure there's an infrastructure around that, because assuming the person that's sitting in the remote setting also needs to operate that with the same competency, there's a whole bunch of data, programming, AI-based innovations that can also support that person in the local environment. So there's a lot of things we're thinking about, but no, it's not going to be fixed in a day.
Of course.
Definitely.
And as much as I want to continue on this conversation, time does not permit. That was Rod Fraser, the MD of Malaysia for Siemens Healthiness. If you want to learn more, just head down to their website and find out more about Siemens Healthiness. Also, there's a lot of resources that can be found on Astro.com, particularly on health management systems as well as health systems. Do check it out on Astro.com. My name is Ibrahim Sani. Catch you in the next one.